If you've been to one of our national parks recently, you've probably noticed that it feels a lot like Disney World. Hordes of people, trams everywhere, lines to go on hikes. But unlike Disney World, which is in Florida, a place so bad it is literally impossible to ruin, the National Park Service has taken some of the most beautiful places on Earth and turned them into theme parks. And it wasn't an accident. The National Park Service was created in 1916 by Woodrow Wilson. Before 1916, the national parks were managed by the Department of the Interior, so the National Park Service was created to manage them. And boy, did they manage the hell out of them. Up until World War II, the national parks were not very popular. A lack of nationwide traveling infrastructure inhibited most people from traveling to the middle of nowhere, Wyoming, just to see water come out of the ground. But after World War II, the American economy exploded, the interstate highway system was constructed, airports were built, but more importantly, American life fundamentally changed. After World War II, the perfect American dream, white picket fence, wife and 2 kids, suburban life came into style, and the American population moved out into the boring-ass suburbs and had a lot more money for things like vacation. And these families started taking these vacations to national parks. But there was a problem. These white picket fence families were not prepared for an actual wilderness experience. Magazines and newspapers of the time warned visitors that they should be prepared for almost anything in the way of personal discomfort, annoyance, and even danger, and called the parks 24 million acres of trouble. Now imagine that. Outside, you might feel uncomfortable or even annoyed. No, that's crazy. We cannot have that. So the national parks began to gain a reputation of being unsafe and uncomfortable. Public calls to increase the national parks budget and to change visitor experiences began to gain popularity. But these calls were resisted by National Park Service Director Newton Drury. Drury was against calls for an increased budget, saying, "We have no money, we can do no harm." Drury thought it was important for the parks to be preserved as they are, without massive infrastructure projects and changes. Drury resisted construction and infrastructure changes until he left his role as director. Without Drury as director, park budgets ballooned and construction began. This is a graph we're going to be referencing a lot. This is a graph of national park visitors over time. There are 3 phases that stand out to me on this graph: the post-World War II era, the post-Mission 66 era, and the modern era. In the post-World War II era, visitors grew rapidly while park budgets remained low, and the parks gained the reputation of being unsafe. Now let's talk about the Mission 66 era. In the Mission 66 era, park visitor increases truly began to reach terminal velocity, with visitors increasing from 60 million at the beginning of the era to more than 250 million by the end of the era. With Drury out as director, the next director of the national parks had a very tight rope to walk. Public cries to make the parks more visitor-friendly had to be balanced with the park's stated mission to preserve and conserve. So in came new National Parks Director Conrad Worth with an instrumental choice to make. After Conrad Worth became director, he began lobbying President Eisenhower for millions of dollars to make the parks a place where visitors felt safe and welcome. In 1955, Worth's wish was granted, and the National Park Service received millions of dollars to build infrastructure in what was known as the Mission 66 project. After Mission 66 passed Congress, the national parks began to be dominated by federal infrastructure, the kind that makes the national parks resemble theme parks. Visitor centers, sprawling road systems, and observation towers were constructed at a rapid pace with little regard for conservation. For example, let's take a look at Smoky Mountain National Park, the most visited national park in the country. Smoky Mountain National Park preserves the pristine beauty of the tallest section of one of the oldest mountain ranges on Earth, the Appalachian Mountains. Or at least it's supposed to. See, the tallest mountain in the park, Clingman's Dome, had a giant observation tower built on top of it in 1959 with money from the Mission 66 project. Clingman's Dome is home to a very rare, endangered spruce fir ecosystem, but has been defaced by a litany of paved asphalt trails and this giant tower. No, I'm not necessarily against the building of the tower. I've been on top of the tower and the view is amazing. But it's not just the tower. It's the paved trails to get to the tower. It's the parking lot that had to be built at the top of the mountain for people to get to the paved trails. It's the roads to get to the parking lot. All of this has a combined effect. And this isn't the only significant southern peak to be constructed upon. Mount Mitchell, the tallest peak in the Appalachian Mountains, had a giant tower constructed on it also in 1959. Brasstown Bald, the tallest peak in Georgia, was home to a rare ecosystem, a bald, grass-topped mountain, until it was leveled and destroyed to build a sprawling observation deck and museum in 1965. Visitors finally felt safe and welcomed. Gone were the days of pesky discomfort and annoyance. Suburban families poured into parks and enjoyed the new infrastructure. But a new problem emerged. Sometimes the wrong type of people were enjoying the national parks. Hippies. These days, the national parks utilize hippie aesthetics for branding and selling merch, but they weren't always so fond of them. During the 50s and 60s, Yosemite National Park experienced a rapid increase in infrastructure and visitors, bringing lots of noise and pollution. But there were already people utilizing Yosemite. Hippies had been living in Yosemite for decades, camping, climbing some of the most daring ascents of the biggest cliffs, and forming communities at the campsites. But the National Park Service saw these people as a stain on the squeaky clean reputation of the parks, so they began arresting them, giving them tickets, and imposing lots of rules that had not previously existed. All the tensions boiled over on July 4th, 1970. Hippies gathered at Yosemite to protest the Vietnam War and began doing something that was not allowed in the parks at the time: having fun. The protesters were attacked by the park rangers, who wished to remove the eyesore of the protest. Park rangers maced and beat the protesters, arresting many of them. After this event, park rangers began carrying firearms and began acting as enforcers of the park's new family-friendly image. And so with that, we come to the modern era we all know. The national parks are theme parks. In this era, growth has flatlined with nearly 300 million visitors per year. National parks are filled with people and things that people have built. The national parks market themselves aggressively as a vacation destination in nature, but many are anything but. However, this is not the reality for every single national park. Yes, the popular national parks are theme parks, but for every Yosemite, there is a Pinnacles, and for every Zion, a Capitol Reef. See, not every national park was affected by the Mission 66 project. Some parks, like Capitol Reef, were too remote and not popular enough to get massive infrastructure builds. Other parks weren't under the jurisdiction of the National Park Service at the time and were spared. Capitol Reef is an example of what a national park should be: a true wilderness experience, no railings, few roads, and real conservation, not only of the nature, but also the history and the culture of that area. It's one of my favorite parks. The national parks have a lot of problems, but in many ways are still great, and they could definitely be a lot worse than they are now. Recently, there has been talk of privatizing national parks. First, it started with corporations like Coca-Cola contributing money to the parks as a tax-deductible gift in exchange for use of the national parks and their branding for marketing purposes. As a part of this deal, Coca-Cola also received special access and tours of the parks for executives and key customers. In 2011, Coca-Cola leveraged these contributions to force the National Park Service to veto a plan to ban the sale of plastic bottles from Grand Canyon National Park. Coca-Cola is a major manufacturer of plastic bottles, and Coca-Cola products are sold in national parks. Luckily, Coca-Cola's role in the veto was exposed, and the National Park Service backed off the veto. Plastic bottles are banned in the Grand Canyon today. Selling of ads has also been considered in national parks. Ads on buses and visitor centers have been considered to increase revenue. Because what could go wrong with that? Why don't we put a giant billboard in front of El Cap? Or maybe into the side of the Grand Canyon we could carve the McDonald's logo. National parks are literally one of the only places you can go in this country where there is not advertising shoved down your throat. But like I said, an even worse idea has been discussed recently: privatizing the national parks. Now, of course, that doesn't mean the parks will become totally privately owned, at least not yet. It just means parts of the parks will become privately owned, and certain key functions of the National Park Service will be taken over by businesses. At a 2019 meeting of the Department of the Interior, privatizing campgrounds, increasing Wi-Fi, adding food trucks, and allowing Amazon deliveries were discussed for national parks. Privatizing campgrounds are at the forefront of the debate. Business owners say they could transform the camping experience from boring, cringe, sleeping on the ground that it is now to cool and hip, with tiny homes, glamping, and cabins. But I've seen the horrors of privatizing natural wonders firsthand. Let's talk about Stone Mountain. 16 miles outside of Atlanta, Georgia, is basically a giant rock called Stone Mountain. And honestly, it's a one-of-a-kind feature. I've never seen something like it. Stone Mountain is owned by the state of Georgia, but it's not managed by the state. It's managed by a business, Hershend Family Entertainment. And because of that, a whole litany of bad shit has happened. The first thing you notice is that it's expensive. $20 per car for entry. Compare that to Georgia's state parks, which are $5 per car. So what does that extra $15 get you? Well, all around the park are attractions. A train, a mini golf course, and a giant sky ride that lifts you to the top of the mountain. Surely those things would be included in the entrance fee. Well, they're not. It costs $45 extra per person to utilize the attractions in the park. And worst of all, there is literally a gigantic carving of Robert E. Lee and his goons carved into the side of the mountain. The carving is literally bigger than a football field. And that's not even the most racist thing to happen at the mountain. Here's a picture of a KKK meeting that happened at the summit of the mountain in 1948. I still remember the first time I saw Stone Mountain. Being from Florida, I had never seen so much as a hill before. And here was this 1,600-foot sheer cliff staring back at me. And as I got closer, I saw this dumbass mural defacing one of the coolest rock formations I had ever seen. And that is the danger of not protecting our parks and continuing to allow construction. No conservation, all profit. And that brings us to today, 2022. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, the parks experienced a few years of high growth, staying consistently above 300 million visitors. The pandemic caused that growth to drop off, but the pandemic is over now, and that growth is poised to continue in the coming years. The Great American Outdoors Act was passed in 2020, giving billions to the parks for repairs and conservation efforts. Conservation groups laud this act as a victory for conservation, and I'm happy the parks are getting this money. The money will go a long way to conserving the parks and making sure the parks don't need to rely on selling benefits to Coca-Cola for money. That being said, I think it's important that this money is spent on conservation, not installing Wi-Fi and not adding glamping. And I certainly hope the parks don't take on the same infrastructure projects that in the 50s and 60s caused our national parks to turn into theme parks. Because remember, if you have no money, you can do no harm. This money is an opportunity to fulfill the promise of the national parks. Conservation first, people second. And it's been backwards for too long. Thank you so much for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing. This is the first video I'm going to be doing in a series about the history of the national parks, so stay tuned for the next one.